Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into the mind of someone who's going to force us to rethink, well, pretty much everything we know about how our society operates. Michel Foucault. If you've ever felt totally boxed in by a performance review or maybe labeled by some random algorithm, or even just felt that weird, nagging pressure to overshare your entire life online, you've actually felt the invisible forces that Foucault spent his entire career exposing. He didn't even really like calling himself a traditional philosopher. He called himself an experimenter. He wasn't interested in just validating what we already know. He wanted to dig into the exact historical conditions that built us into who we are today and then ask, hey, could we be different? So buckle up because we're going to unpack some seriously mind-bending ideas about how we're controlled, how we're studied, and ultimately how we understand our own identities. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start by rethinking traditional power, then explore the power and knowledge connection. After that, we'll get into constructing madness and normality before looking at surveillance and the Panopticon. Finally, we'll wrap things up with subjectivity and freedom. All right, let's jump right into Section 1, Rethinking Traditional Power, or moving beyond the king and the law. Let's kick things off with a pretty massive question, one that completely challenges our basic assumptions about society. Where does power actually come from? If I asked you to draw a picture of power right now, you'd probably sketch out a king sitting on a throne, or a police officer, or maybe a billionaire CEO. But Foucault argues that this is just a completely outdated way of looking at how our lives are actually governed today.
Seriously, forget the whole top-down view where power is just this static possession held by a king. Foucault called that the juridico-discursive view. It's basically a giant no. It's a strict law that just restricts you. He completely flips this on its head. He says actually power is bottom-up. Think about power more like peer pressure or office culture or the societal expectations baked into social media algorithms. It's this massive network of force relations operating absolutely everywhere all at once. And here's the real kicker. It doesn't just oppress, it actually produces things. It's kind of like Newtonian physics, right? Power is a force that pushes and pulls us in our everyday relationships. It's not a king giving an order anymore. It's the academic transcript tracking a student's every single move, or that HR metric defining what makes a quote-unquote good employee.
Which brings us perfectly to Section 2, the power and knowledge connection. Essentially, how we know what we know. Now, Foucault almost always wrote the words power and knowledge together. Why? Because he believed they don't just happen to exist side by side, they literally produce one another. Our power arrangements dictate what kind of knowledge gets stamped as true, and then that scientific knowledge turns around and reinforces the power structures. Think about things like IQ tests or BMI charts. The power to decide what gets measured creates the truth of who is considered smart or who is healthy. And then that truth justifies the power to sort people into different schools or different insurance brackets. You literally cannot have one without the other in the modern era. And what's super fascinating here is that the human sciences, so we're talking psychology, sociology, psychiatry, criminology, they didn't just naturally emerge out of pure detached scientific curiosity a couple of centuries ago. No, they emerged deeply enmeshed in the exact problems and practices of power. They were built right alongside modern institutions to solve a very specific problem. How do you efficiently manage, train, and squeeze the absolute maximum productivity out of massive populations of everyday people? Foucault writes, the exercise of power perpetually creates knowledge, and conversely, knowledge constantly induces effects of power. Now, to be totally clear, he isn't saying that all science is just a giant lie or some crazy conspiracy. Not at all. He's just pointing out that to control a population effectively, you have to measure them, you have to survey them, you have to know them deeply. Power funds and uses this knowledge because, well, it works. It's highly serviceable and incredibly efficient. Power absolutely needs this data to operate. All right, moving right along to Section 3, Constructing Madness and Normality, the Human Sciences and the Abnormal. As these human sciences started growing, they naturally started categorizing us. I mean, before this, human behavior was just this vast, kind of messy gray area spectrum. But suddenly, we created these strict checkboxes. Think of modern HR personality tests or standardized mental health diagnoses. With the rise of these sciences, we established incredibly rigid frameworks to distinguish the normal citizen from the abnormal one, the sane from the mad. Foucault argued that these labels aren't just objective facts of nature. They're actually historical tools. They give society the permission it needs to step in, manage, medicate, or correct you. And then Foucault drops this incredibly poetic reversal. He says, the soul is the prison of the body.
Think about that for a second. The old religious idea was that our clunky physical body trapped our pure ethereal soul. But Foucault argues that today, your soul, and by that he means your psychological profile, your professional brand, your digital footprint, that is what actually restricts your physical freedom. Your body is trapped by this relentless, exhausting need to maintain this deep, constantly analyzed, normal identity. Because remember, modern power isn't just a king yelling no. It's highly productive. It literally reconstructs our desires so they align with what's considered normal. We don't even need a king threatening us to fall in line anymore. We enthusiastically police our own normality. Power produces this deep sense of self that feels an absolute compulsion to constantly confess its inner feelings. We confess to therapists, to life coaches, to HR departments, and by relentlessly oversharing every detail of our lives on social media. We are actively participating in our own psychological surveillance. Okay, Section 4, Surveillance and the Panopticon. Let's look at the literal architecture of this disciplinary power. So disciplinary power is Foucault's term for the extremely specific, meticulous methods used by modern institutions. We're talking schools, military barracks, hospitals, prisons. And the goal here isn't just to punish people. The goal is to carefully watch, examine, record, and measure individuals to make them highly productive, yet completely obedient. Think about an Amazon warehouse tracking your every single step and scan, or a high school meticulously logging how long you take in the bathroom. You are measured specifically so you can be useful, but totally docile. Institutions actually pull this off through 3 specific techniques. Think back to your time in school. This is going to sound super familiar. First, hierarchical observation. The teacher sits at the front of the room, rendering everyone constantly visible, like this unblinking eye. Second, normalizing judgment. Every little micro-behavior, sitting perfectly still, raising your hand to speak, is constantly micromanaged and corrected against the accepted norm. And finally, the examination. Observation and judgment combine into a report card. You are literally transformed into a documented case file, a permanent record of exactly who you are and how you measure up. Historically, society completely inverted its architecture to achieve this. Back in ancient Greece, architecture was built for spectacle, right? You had massive crowds watching a few actors in a theater. Modern architecture flips that entirely. We build systems, open-plan offices, glass-walled classrooms, vast digital networks, so that a single individual, or maybe just an algorithm, can observe the greatest possible number of people. We shifted from a society of communal spectacle to a society of relentless, nonstop surveillance. And the ultimate architectural expression of this is the Panopticon. It's a prison design where inmates can always be watched from a central tower, but the psychological trick is they never know exactly when they're being watched. The true genius, and honestly the terror of the Panopticon effect, is that because you might be watched at any given second, you internalize that gaze. You basically become your own guard. You assume responsibility for your own constraints, and you spontaneously self-police. This is exactly how your smartphone or your workplace chat software functions right now. You behave perfectly, not because someone is standing there threatening you, but because the surveillance is in your pocket. And more importantly, it's in your own head. Zero physical violence required. Which brings us to our final section, Section 5, Subjectivity and Freedom, navigating this entire modern web of power. Foucault really forces us to look at subjectivity not as some eternal natural soul that we're just born with, but as a historical process. Who you are, your subjectivity, is constructed in, through, and sometimes directly in opposition to the categories created by these power relations. Your entire concept of being a good student, or a productive employee, or a normal citizen was built by the exact power and knowledge frameworks we just talked about. You are, quite literally, built by the history you were born into. And everyday modern systems, from your childhood GPA to your adult credit score to your daily step count, their ultimate goal is to produce what Foucault called calculable man. They want an individual who is highly capable, extremely efficient at their job, but who remains entirely docile and manageable. We're trained from day one to be easily measurable data points, functioning perfectly inside a much larger machine. But wait, it's actually not all doom and gloom. Foucault doesn't just look at power as constraint, all this ubiquitous surveillance and normalization we've been talking about. Because power isn't just a top-down cage. Because it's a dynamic, bottom-up relationship, it inherently creates friction, and that creates the opportunity for resistance. If power creates these categories, we can actually use those very same categories to create reverse discourses. By questioning these historical truths and realizing, hey, these were just invented by human systems, we actually give ourselves the power to carve out completely new identities and totally new ways of living. So I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought. In a modern world that is built on endless, invisible surveillance and this crushing, constant pressure to be normal, Are you just a docile body playing out a pre-written role? Or, now that you can actually see the invisible architecture of power all around you, how are you going to practice what Foucault called the work of freedom? How will you challenge the history that made you and dare to think differently? Keep questioning everything. And thanks for joining us on this explainer.